I pulled into the gravel lot of the Sinclair station and killed my Honda's engine, already second-guessing this decision. The building looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Faded white walls, rusted metal trim, and a sign that flickered between open and darkness every few seconds. Highway 200 stretched empty in both directions, no other buildings visible through the October darkness. My bank account showed $37. Rent was due in 6 days. The math was simple enough, even if everything else about this job felt wrong. The day shift guy had introduced himself as Greg when I'd interviewed yesterday, though his name tag read Robert. Mid-40s, stocky build, friendly enough smile that never quite reached his pale blue eyes. He'd hired me on the spot after I'd filled out a basic application, no background check or references required. Should have been a red flag, but desperate people don't get to be picky. I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat and walked toward the glass doors. Greg met me halfway, already pulling on a worn leather jacket. Mason, right? Good timing. He handed me a crumpled piece of paper, the edges soft from handling. Night shift rules. Read them, follow them, don't ask questions. The paper felt warm, like he'd been gripping it for hours. 7 rules written in different pens, some crossed out and rewritten. 1. Never trust customers asking for help after 10 p.m. 2. Stay out of the bathroom completely. 3. Lock up and close blinds at exactly 3 a.m. 4. Don't answer the phone between 12:30 and 1 a.m. 5. Give the homeless man only 1 water bottle when he asks. 6. Keep the freezer door closed after midnight 7. Never go outside during shift hours. I looked up from the paper. Is this some kind of joke? Greg's smile disappeared. Do I look like I'm joking? Those rules aren't suggestions, kid. They're survival instructions. Follow them exactly or you won't make it through the week. Survival instructions for what? You'll figure it out. He pulled his keys from his pocket, the metal jangling against the quiet. Register's easy enough. Coffee machine's broken, don't bother trying to fix it. Mop's in the back if you get bored. Stockroom's locked. Management keeps the key. I wanted to ask about the customers, about what kind of help I wasn't supposed to provide, but Greg was already walking toward a dented blue Ford pickup. The truck's headlights swept across the lot as he pulled away, leaving me alone with the buzzing fluorescent lights and a growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake. The station felt smaller from inside. 3 aisles of overpriced snacks and motor oil, a coffee area with an out-of-order sign taped to the machine, and a register counter that had seen better decades. Behind me, a narrow hallway led to what I assumed was the bathroom and storage areas. I folded the rules paper and slipped it into my jeans pocket. The first few hours passed quietly. A trucker stopped for gas and Red Bull around 9, paying with cash and barely making eye contact. An older woman bought cigarettes and lottery tickets, complaining about her luck while I rang up her purchase. Normal people doing normal things, making me feel foolish for taking Greg's warnings seriously. By 10:30, I'd reorganized the candy display twice and raid every magazine in the rack. The highway stayed empty, just occasional headlights passing without stopping. I'd started to relax when I heard tires on gravel. A red pickup truck, paint faded to the color of dried blood, pulled up to the gas pumps. The woman who got out moved with frantic energy, her blonde hair falling out of a messy ponytail. She ran toward the store, leaving her truck door hanging open. She burst through the entrance, wild-eyed and breathing hard. "Please, you have to help me. My baby's choking, she's in the truck and I can't get her to breathe." Every instinct told me to move, to run outside and help save a child's life. My hand was already reaching for the door handle when the crumpled paper crinkled in my pocket. Never trust customers asking for help after 10 p.m. I stopped, my fingers an inch from the door. "Call 911, I can give you directions to the hospital." "There's no time." Her voice cracked, desperate and pleading. "She's turning blue. Please, just help me get her out of the car seat." Through the window, I could see her truck. The passenger door hung open, but I couldn't make out anything inside. No crying, no sounds of distress, just silence. "I can't leave the store," I said, hating how hollow it sounded. "Company policy." Her expression shifted, desperation morphing into something harder. "What kind of person are you? A baby is dying and you're worried about company policy?" I stayed behind the counter, my hands shaking. She pressed against the glass door, her palms leaving smudges as she stared at me with growing anger. "Help me," she said, but her voice had changed. Flatter now, less emotional. "Just come outside and help me." The way she said it made my skin crawl. Not a plea anymore, but almost a command. I checked the clock on the register. 11:47 p.m. "I'm sorry," I said. "I can't." She stood there for another minute, watching me through the glass. Then she smiled, an expression that belonged on a different face entirely, and walked back to her truck. No hurry now, no frantic energy, just calm, measured steps. She drove away without looking back, leaving me alone with the taste of copper in my mouth and the growing understanding that Greg hadn't been messing around. The next hour crawled by. I kept checking the clock, dreading 12:30 a.m. like a doctor's appointment I couldn't cancel. When the time came, the phone rang exactly as I'd expected. The sound cut through the quiet store, sharp and insistent. I stared at the black cordless handset sitting next to the register, willing it to stop. It didn't. Ring after ring, each one feeling like a personal attack. My hand twitched toward the phone 3 different times, basic customer service training warring with Greg's warnings. By the 4th ring, I'd started to rationalize. Maybe it was an emergency. Maybe someone really needed help. I pulled the rules from my pocket and read them again. Don't answer the phone between 12:30 and 1 a.m. No exceptions, no explanations. The ringing continued for 28 minutes. I counted each one, watching the clock's digital display change with agonizing slowness. At exactly 1 a.m., the phone went silent. I'd barely started to relax when I heard the first creak. The bathroom door, which I'd noticed was closed when Greg left, now stood slightly open. Just a crack, maybe 2 inches, but enough to see darkness beyond. I hadn't heard it open, hadn't seen any movement, but there it was. Another creak, like old hinges under pressure. The door opened wider. I backed away from the hallway, putting the register counter between me and whatever was happening back there. Scratching sounds echoed from inside the bathroom, fingernails on tile, or maybe something sharper. The noise continued for several minutes, rhythmic and purposeful, like something was carving patterns into the walls. Rule number 2 seemed increasingly wise. I stayed behind the counter, gripping the edge until my knuckles went white, and waited for the sounds to stop. They didn't stop until 2:47 a.m. At 3 o'clock sharp, I locked the front doors and pulled down the window blinds, following the rules exactly. I'd barely finished when something hit the glass. The impact shook the entire storefront, rattling bottles on the shelves. Then another hit, and another, like someone throwing rocks at the windows. But these impacts had weight behind them, force that spoke of something much larger than stones. The pounding moved around the building, circling from window to window. Whatever was out there had size and strength that made me grateful for the walls between us. The attacks continued for 15 minutes, systematic and patient, testing every piece of glass for weakness. When morning finally arrived, I found myself still crouched behind the counter, rules paper clutched in my sweating palm. The attacks had stopped around 4 a.m., leaving me alone with the humming fluorescent lights and the growing certainty that I'd experienced something impossible. Greg arrived at 6, looking rested and cheerful. He took one look at my face and chuckled. "Rough night?" I handed him the rules paper, now damp with sweat. "What the hell is this place?" "Just a gas station, kid. You coming back tonight?" I should have said no. Should have walked away, found another job, moved to a different state if necessary, but $37 doesn't buy many options, and I'd survived one night already. "Yeah," I said. "I'll be back." Greg's smile widened, and for just a moment his pale blue eyes looked genuinely pleased. The drive back to the gas station felt like volunteering for surgery without anesthesia. I'd spent most of the day trying to convince myself that last night had been stress-induced hallucinations, maybe a reaction to the anxiety medication I'd been rationing. But the taste of copper still lingered in my mouth whenever I thought about that woman's smile, and my hands started shaking every time I remembered the sounds from the bathroom. Greg had texted around 3 that afternoon. "Hey kid, how'd your first night go? Fair warning, the visitors are usually more active during new employee periods. Should calm down after a week or two. Visitors. Like they were expected guests instead of whatever had been testing the windows with impacts that could crack concrete." I pulled into the lot 20 minutes early, hoping to catch Greg before the shift change. Maybe I could get some actual answers instead of cryptic warnings and casual mentions of supernatural house guests. But the evening shift worker I found inside wasn't Greg. The woman behind the counter looked to be around 30, with black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and dark eyes that seemed to catch every detail. Her name tag read Aisha, and she was restocking the cigarette display with methodical efficiency. "You must be Mason," she said without looking up. Greg called in sick, first time in 2 years according to the schedule book. Sick? I set my backpack down next to the register. He seemed fine yesterday. Yeah, well. Aisha finished with the cigarettes and moved to straightening the lottery ticket dispenser. Convenient timing, right? New guy's second night, and suddenly Greg needs a personal day. Something in her tone suggested this wasn't the first suspicious coincidence she'd witnessed. I studied her face, looking for signs of the same haunted exhaustion I'd seen in my bathroom mirror that morning. "How long have you worked here?" 6 months on the evening shift. She glanced toward the hallway, then back to me. Long enough to see 3 night shift people quit in their first week. Well, 2 quit. 1 just disappeared. My stomach dropped. Disappeared? John Northstar. Nice kid, maybe a year younger than you. Worked 4 nights, then didn't show up for his 5th shift. We found his car still in the parking lot the next morning, keys on the driver's seat, wallet and phone still inside. Police filed a missing person report, but nothing ever came of it. I remembered the name from Greg's casual mention yesterday. Something about the previous guy not working out. When was this? 2 months ago, right before they hired the next guy who lasted 3 days before walking out mid-shift. Then came Marcus, who made it 6 nights before quitting over the phone at 2 a.m. Then you. Aisha pulled her purse from under the counter and slung it over her shoulder. She moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone eager to leave, but she paused at the door. "Mason? Those rules Greg gave you, follow them exactly. Don't try to be creative. Don't look for loopholes. The people who ignored them are the ones who didn't make it past their first week." She left me alone with that cheerful thought and the growing certainty that I was participating in something with a very specific and very dangerous pattern. The early evening passed quietly. A few regular customers stopped for gas and snacks, normal interactions that helped me pretend this was just a regular job with slightly eccentric workplace policies. But around 9:30, I noticed something that made my hands go cold. The rules paper Greg had given me was gone. I checked my pockets 3 times, then searched the area around the register. Nothing. In its place, taped to the side of the cash drawer where I couldn't miss it, was a different piece of paper. Same size, same color, but the handwriting was different. Darker ink, more aggressive strokes. Several of the original rules had been crossed out with heavy black lines. New ones were written in the margins and squeezed between existing lines. The paper looked like it had been edited by multiple people over time. A collaboration between different sets of priorities. 1. Never trust customers asking for help after 10 p.m. Trust no one after dark. 2. Stay out of the bathroom completely. 3. Lock up and close blinds at exactly 3 m. 2:30 a.m. Earlier is better. 4. Don't answer the phone between 12:30, 1. Never answer the phone. 5. Give the homeless man only 1 water bottle when he asks. 2 bottles, he knows. 6. Keep the freezer door closed after midnight. 7. Never go outside during shift hours. 8. New. Count the customers. Always count the customers. 9. New. If the lights flicker 3 times, hide behind the counter until sunrise. The crossed-out rules were in Greg's handwriting, the additions in something shakier and more desperate, like someone had been making corrections based on hard-won experience. I was still staring at the paper when I heard footsteps on gravel. Through the window, I could see a figure approaching the entrance. Tall, lean, wearing layers of worn clothing and carrying a beat-up backpack. The homeless man from the rules, arriving 40 minutes earlier than he had the previous night. He pushed through the door with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. Up close, I could see he was probably in his 50s, with long gray-streaked hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to find my nervousness amusing. "Evening," he said, voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "Could use some water if you've got it." I glanced at the modified rules. 2 bottles. He knows. The handwriting suggested someone had learned from experience that 1 bottle wasn't enough, though I couldn't imagine what kind of experience that might be. I grabbed 2 bottles from the cooler and set them on the counter. No charge. He studied my face while I rang up the transaction, those dark eyes reading something in my expression that I didn't know I was showing. When I handed him the bottles, he chuckled, a sound with more knowing in it than humor. "You read the updated version, I see, smart boy." He tucked the bottles into his backpack, though I noticed they didn't mention the most important change. What change? The rules are evolving faster now, getting more specific, more desperate. He shouldered his pack and headed for the door, then paused. "Previous guy, John?" He tried to be clever about it. Thought he could game the system, find the loopholes. But the system adapts, you see. It learns from each new player. The door started to swing shut behind him, but he caught it with one weathered hand. "You won't last much longer than the others," he said, and his tone was almost sympathetic. "The only question is whether you'll be smart enough to run before it's too late, or if you'll stick around long enough to find out what happens to the ones who don't." The door closed with a soft chime, leaving me alone with the smell of coffee grounds and motor oil, and the growing understanding that I wasn't just following arbitrary rules. I was participating in some kind of test with a very high failure rate. The next 2 hours crawled by. Every small sound made me jump. Every car that passed without stopping felt like a reprieve. I kept reading the modified rules, trying to understand what had changed and why. The handwriting in the additions was shaky, urgent, like someone writing in poor light or under extreme stress. At exactly midnight, I heard the click of a latch releasing. The freezer door, which had been firmly closed since my arrival, swung open with a soft whoosh of escaping cold air. I approached slowly, following the beam of my phone's flashlight into the depths of the unit. Empty. Completely, utterly empty. No ice cream, no frozen drinks, no ice bags, just bare metal shelving and walls that showed deep gouges in the aluminum lining. The scratches ran in parallel lines, too regular to be accidental damage and too deep to have been made by human fingernails. They looked like claw marks from something large enough to stand upright inside the freezer compartment. But it was the pattern that made my blood go cold. The scratches weren't random. They formed crude shapes, circles, triangles, lines that intersected at specific angles, like symbols, like someone or something had been leaving messages on the walls. I backed away from the freezer, letting the door swing shut, and stood in the humming fluorescent light trying to process what I'd just seen. The rules weren't protecting me from random supernatural events. They were part of something organized, something that had been going on long enough to develop its own communication system. Someone was orchestrating this. The modified rules, the pattern of employees quitting or disappearing, the way Greg had vanished tonight when I might have had questions. None of this was accidental. I was being managed, guided through some kind of process that had specific steps and predictable outcomes. The previous employees hadn't been random victims of supernatural activity. They'd been participants in something deliberate, something that required fresh subjects every few weeks. And I was the latest volunteer. I didn't sleep, couldn't even pretend to try. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of gas station coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the modified rules paper until the words started blurring together. The scratches in the freezer kept replaying in my mind. Those deliberate symbols carved into metal by something that had opposable thumbs and a message to leave behind. By 7 a.m., I'd made a decision. If I was going to survive whatever game Robert was playing, I needed to understand the rules he wasn't telling me about. The Miles City Public Library opened at 9, and I was waiting in the parking lot when the first librarian arrived. A woman about my age with long black hair and wire-rimmed glasses unlocked the front doors, glancing at me with mild curiosity as I followed her inside. "Early morning researcher?" she asked, flipping switches to bring the building's lights to life. Her name tag read Jessica Eastman, and she moved through the space with the efficient familiarity of someone who'd been working here for years. "I need to look into some local history. Property records, newspaper archives, anything about Highway 200. "Specific area?" Jessica led me past rows of books toward a bank of computers near the back wall. "That highway covers a lot of ground. The Sinclair station. I'm trying to find out about the land it was built on." Jessica paused, her hand hovering over the computer mouse. "You work there?" "Night shift." I watched her face for a reaction, noting the slight tightening around her eyes. "Why? Have you heard something about it?" "Nothing specific." She pulled up a database search screen, but her tone had shifted from helpful to cautious. "Just that it seems to have trouble keeping employees. High turnover rate." I settled into the chair next to her as she navigated through digital archives. The first few searches turned up basic property information. The gas station had been built in 2020 on a parcel of land that had previously been part of a larger family farm. But it was the name on the previous deed that made my blood go cold. "Northstar," I said, reading over Jessica's shoulder. "Daniel Northstar sold the land 5 years ago." "That's right." Jessica clicked through to newspaper archives, pulling up several articles from local papers. The family had owned that property for generations, raised cattle, grew some crops, but Daniel sold everything after his son went missing. The first article was dated March 15, 2019. "Local man missing after camping trip." A photo showed a young guy who looked a few years older than me, with dark hair and serious eyes. John Northstar, age 27, had disappeared during a solo camping trip on family land. His truck was found parked near a creek about 2 miles from the farmhouse, but search teams never located him despite weeks of effort. "They never found the body?" I asked. "Never found anything. Police figured he'd fallen into the creek during spring runoff, maybe got swept downstream, but the family never accepted that explanation." Jessica scrolled through more articles, showing me the progression of the story. Daniel spent months organizing private search parties, hiring investigators. Nearly bankrupted himself looking for answers. The timeline was starting to form in my head. John disappeared in March 2019. Daniel sold the land to Morrison Corporate Holdings in September of the same year. Construction on the gas station began that winter, opening in late 2020. "What about after the sale? Did Daniel stay in the area?" Jessica's expression grew more guarded. "He died 2 years ago. Heart attack, officially. But people said the stress of losing John and then selling the family land broke something in him." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Daniel was my father." I stared at her, understanding flooding through me. "You're a Northstar." "I use my mother's maiden name professionally. Eastman draws less attention than Northstar around here." Jessica's voice carried a weight of old pain. "People think the family is cursed. bad luck follows the name. I absorbed this information while Jessica continued searching. The pattern was becoming clearer, but I needed more specifics about Robert's involvement. Can you search employment records? I'm looking for information about a guy named Robert Price. Or maybe Greg Price. He would have been hired right around the time the station opened. Jessica pulled up a different database, typing in variations of the name. After several minutes, she found something that made her frown. Robert Price, hired as day shift manager in January 2021. But before that, she clicked through several screens, following a trail of previous addresses and employment history. He worked at a truck stop in Wyoming from 2017 to 2019. Before that, a convenience store in Nevada. And before that, another gas station in Oregon. What's wrong with that? Look at the dates. Jessica pointed to the screen. Each job lasted approximately 2 years, and in each location there were reports of missing persons cases involving young men who worked night shifts at his establishments. My hands went numb. Missing persons cases? 3 in Oregon, 2 in Nevada, 1 in Wyoming, all males between 18 and 25, all employed in late-night retail positions. Jessica printed out the search results, her movements becoming more urgent. The pattern is almost identical. They work for a few weeks, then disappear without explanation. Usually their cars are found in the parking lots, but the employees themselves are never seen again. I stared at the papers in my hands, seeing my own near future laid out in black and white. Robert wasn't just running some random supernatural operation at our gas station. He was following a specific pattern he'd perfected over years, moving from location to location and feeding on a steady supply of desperate young employees. "There's something else," Jessica said quietly. "The Wyoming missing person case. That happened right before John disappeared. The timing suggests Robert was already in this area, possibly scouting locations when John went missing. The implication hit me like cold water. You think Robert had something to do with John's disappearance? I think Robert has been planning this operation for a long time, and I think John wasn't a random victim who happened to go missing before the gas station was built." Jessica met my eyes, and I could see real fear there. I think he was Robert's first victim in this area. I left the library with a folder full of printed articles and a growing certainty that I was walking into a trap that had been 5 years in the making. But I also had something I hadn't possessed that morning: specific information about Robert's pattern and methodology. If I was going to survive this, I needed to understand not just what he was doing, but how he'd done it before. The drive to the Northstar property took 20 minutes on back roads that wound through rolling hills and abandoned farmland. The address from the property records led me to a gravel driveway that disappeared around a bend through overgrown trees. I parked at the road and walked the quarter-mile to what remained of the farmhouse. The building looked like it had been abandoned for years. Peeling white paint, sagging front porch, windows dark and empty. But as I got closer, I noticed signs that someone had been maintaining the place. The walkway was clear of debris, and the front door looked recently repaired. I was debating whether to knock when a voice called out from behind me. "You're the new night shift guy." I spun around to find a young man watching me from the tree line. Dark hair, serious eyes, wearing layers of worn flannel and denim. He looked exactly like the photo from the newspaper archive, just older and thinner. "John Northstar," I said. "That's right." He emerged from the trees, moving with the careful awareness of someone who'd spent months watching for threats. "And you're Mason. I've been watching the station, saw Robert training you on your first night. You were listening?" "I watch everything Robert does. Been tracking his movements for years now." John gestured toward the farmhouse. "Took me that long to figure out what he's really doing and how to stop it." We sat on the front porch steps while John explained what I'd stumbled into. The supernatural events at the gas station weren't random occurrences. They were deliberately summoned manifestations that Robert controlled through a combination of psychological manipulation and ritual knowledge he'd learned from previous victims. Each person he targets teaches him something new, John said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won understanding. The entities he commands get stronger every time he breaks someone, but the process requires specific conditions: isolation, desperation, and most importantly, sustained terror over multiple nights. The rules, I said, understanding dawning. They're designed to create maximum fear. Exactly. But they also keep you alive long enough for Robert to harvest what he needs. The people who followed the rules perfectly lasted longer, which meant more terror to feed on. The ones who broke the rules died quickly, which was less useful to him. I pulled out the modified rules paper, showing John the crossed-out sections and desperate additions. Someone was trying to survive longer. John studied the handwriting, and his expression grew grim. I've seen Robert's other victims through surveillance. They all try to modify the rules eventually, thinking they can outsmart the system. But the handwriting gets more desperate each time, more frantic. This person was close to breaking completely. What happened to him? Robert got what he needed and moved on to the next subject. Most of Robert's survivors end up in institutions or homeless shelters, their minds too broken to ever fully heal. I've been trying to track them down, but Robert's careful about covering his trail. The afternoon sun was starting to fade, and I knew I had to make a decision about tonight's shift. Going back meant walking into Robert's trap, but not going back meant abandoning any chance of stopping him before he found another victim. There has to be a way to fight back, I said. You survived. You escaped. I didn't escape. John's smile was bitter. I played dead. Let Robert think his process had worked, then faked my disappearance to buy time to research his methods. But he knows I'm alive, and he knows I'm watching. In fact, he's been counting on it. What do you mean? You're not his next random victim, Mason. You're bait. Robert has been waiting for me to make contact with his new employee because he needs something from me that he couldn't get when I was just another scared kid working night shifts. John stood up, brushing dust from his jeans. He needs me to come back voluntarily, and now that I've made contact with you, the real game can begin. I felt the last piece of hope drain out of me. Even my investigation, even finding John and learning the truth, was part of Robert's larger plan. He'd been orchestrating every step, knowing exactly how a desperate person would respond to the clues he'd left behind. So, what happens now? I asked. John looked toward the road, where my Honda sat next to the mailbox like a beacon marking my location for anyone who might be watching. Now you decide whether you're going to be another victim or if you're willing to help me finish what I started 5 years ago. He met my eyes, and I could see the same determination that had kept him alive this long. But either way, Robert's going to be expecting you tonight, and this time, he won't be playing by the rules. The drive back to the gas station felt like a funeral procession with me, as both mourner and corpse. John's words echoed in my head, "You're bait," while my hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to leave permanent impressions. Every rational thought screamed at me to keep driving, to get on the interstate and not stop until I hit a state where Robert Price had never heard of night shift employees. But $37 doesn't buy much freedom, and running away wouldn't stop Robert from finding his next desperate victim. At least now I understood what I was walking into, even if that knowledge felt more like a death sentence than an advantage. The parking lot looked the same as always. Empty gravel, flickering pole light, that sense of being watched by something just beyond the edge of vision. But Robert's pickup truck sat next to the building instead of gone for the day, and I could see him through the window standing behind the counter like he'd been waiting for me. No Aisha tonight. No convenient absence to let me settle in and pretend this was just another retail job with weird rules. Just Robert, smiling that same friendly smile that had never quite reached his pale blue eyes. I parked and sat in my car for a full minute, watching him through the glass. He wasn't moving around or doing any kind of work, just standing there, watching me back, perfectly still except for that slight upturn of his mouth, like a spider who'd spent all day preparing his web and was finally ready to see what he'd caught. The October air hit me like a slap when I got out of the Honda, colder than it had been the previous nights, with a metallic taste that made my teeth ache. I'd barely made it 3 steps toward the entrance when Robert pushed through the door, not waiting for me to come inside. "Mason?" His voice carried that same cheerful tone I remembered from my first day, but now I could hear the calculation underneath it. Right on time, though I have to admit I wasn't entirely sure you'd show up tonight. "Yeah, well." I shouldered my backpack, trying to keep my voice steady. "Rent's due in 4 days. Always about the money with you young people." Robert stepped aside to let me pass, but he moved closer than necessary, close enough that I could smell coffee and something else, something sharp and antiseptic like cleaning chemicals. Though I suspect tonight isn't really about the paycheck, is it? Inside, the gas station looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. The familiar hum of refrigeration units and fluorescent lights now sounded ominous, like machinery designed for purposes I hadn't been told about. The lottery ticket dispenser that Aisha had straightened so carefully the night before sat askew, tickets scattered across the floor. Robert locked the door behind us and flipped the sign to "closed," though we weren't supposed to close until midnight. When I started to question him, he held up one hand in a gesture that was polite, but somehow final. "I think we're past the point of pretending this is a normal retail position, don't you?" He walked behind the counter, moving with casual confidence through space he clearly knew better than I'd realized. "I know you've been to the library today. I know you met with Jessica Eastman, who used to be Jessica Northstar before she decided the family name carried too much baggage." My blood went cold. "How do you know about your little research expedition?" "Mason, I've been running operations like this for over 15 years. You think I don't keep track of who visits local libraries asking questions about missing persons and property records?" Robert's smile widened, and for the first time it looked genuine. "I've been looking forward to this conversation." He reached under the counter and pulled out a folder thick with papers and photographs. Not the gas station's normal paperwork, but something personal that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The fear and desperation of night shift employees is necessary to maintain my control over the entities I command. Robert opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings, missing person reports, and photos of young men who looked disturbingly similar to me. All desperate, all isolated, all with the same hollow look around their eyes that I'd been seeing in my bathroom mirror. Fear's an energy source, you see. Raw terror, properly cultivated and harvested, can power things that most people would consider impossible. I backed toward the door, but Robert's casual movement put him between me and the exit without seeming threatening. Just a friendly coworker wanting to chat. "The rules weren't random," he continued, turning pages in the folder like he was showing me a photo album. "They were designed to create maximum stress and paranoia while keeping victims alive long enough to provide sustained fear. Too much terror too quickly and the subject breaks completely, which is wasteful. Too little, and there's not enough energy to work with." The photos showed faces I recognized from Jessica's research, the missing young men from Oregon, Nevada, Wyoming. But these weren't newspaper photos or DMV pictures. These were personal shots, candid moments that could only have been taken by someone who knew these people, who had spent time with them. "You took these," I said. "I document my work. Professional pride, you might say." Robert reached the end of the folder and closed it with the satisfied air of someone finishing a favorite book. "Though I have to admit, you've been one of my more interesting subjects. Most people break completely by the 3rd night. You're still functional enough to conduct research and make friends." He gestured toward the hallway that led to the bathroom and storage area, the same hallway I'd been avoiding for 3 nights. Let me show you something that might help explain your situation." I didn't want to follow him, but refusing felt like it would trigger something worse than cooperation. Robert walked ahead of me with the relaxed pace of a museum guide, pointing out features of the building like I was getting a behind-the-scenes tour. The bathroom door that opens by itself? There's a mechanism in the frame, triggered by a timer. The sounds you hear inside are recordings played through speakers hidden in the ceiling tiles. He pushed open the bathroom door casually, showing me what had terrified me for 3 nights. Just a normal bathroom with normal tiles, no supernatural scratching sounds. The phone that rings precisely between 12:30 and 1 a.m.? Autodialer connected to a cell phone I keep in my truck. We stopped at the storage room door, which I'd never seen opened. Robert produced a key from his pocket and turned it with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times before. The real magic happens back here. The storage room was deeper than the building's exterior suggested, extending back into what should have been empty space. But it wasn't empty. The walls were lined with shelves, and every shelf was filled with personal belongings. Wallets, phones, keys, jewelry, pieces of clothing. Each collection was carefully labeled with a name and dates. Marcus Rivera, March 2023. Tommy Chen, January 2023. David Santos, November 2022. Personal belongings from previous employees who hadn't escaped like John did. Robert ran his finger along one of the labels like he was reading a library catalog. Each person leaves behind a psychic imprint on their possessions. When properly concentrated and maintained, these imprints can be used to power more significant supernatural manifestations. The shelves went back further than I could see in the dim light from the storage room's single bulb. Years of collections, dozens of names, a museum of people who had walked into this same trap and never walked out. John Northstar was my first success in this location, Robert continued, pulling a wallet from one of the nearby shelves. But he was also my first significant failure. Most subjects break completely during their final night. John managed to fake his psychological collapse convincingly enough that I thought I'd completed the process. He opened the wallet, revealing a driver's license photo of John from 5 years ago. Younger, happier, completely unaware of what was coming. It took me months to realize he'd escaped with his mind intact. By then, he'd already gone underground, started researching my methods, building a case against me. Robert put the wallet back in its precise position on the shelf. But you see, that apparent failure became part of a larger plan. We walked deeper into the hidden room, past more shelves of belongings, toward a space that opened up into something resembling a workshop. Tables covered with books, maps, detailed charts tracking lunar cycles and weather patterns. Everything organized with the obsessive care of someone who had been perfecting his craft for years. I had been moving from town to town for years, finding isolated locations where I could practice my psychological experiments without interference. Robert gestured toward the charts, which showed locations across multiple states. But each move meant starting over, rebuilding my collection, learning new local conditions. Very inefficient. A digital clock on one of the tables showed 11:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, it would be midnight, the time Robert had mentioned for beginning his process. John's survival presented an opportunity. If I could draw him back here voluntarily, terrified and desperate to save someone else, his psychic energy would be magnified exponentially. Fear for others is always more powerful than simple self-preservation. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. My investigation hadn't been clever detective work. Robert had left exactly the right clues in exactly the right places, knowing that someone desperate enough to work night shifts would eventually go looking for answers. You wanted me to find Jessica. You wanted me to meet John. I wanted you to accumulate the maximum possible terror over multiple nights, then return here with the knowledge that you were walking into a trap. Robert checked his watch like a cook timing a complicated recipe. The supernatural events that had terrified you were real, but they were bound to my will and fed on the psychic energy of traumatized victims. As if summoned by his words, the temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees. The single light bulb started flickering, not with electrical problems, but with something that felt intentional, rhythmic. From somewhere deeper in the hidden space came the sound of movement. Not mechanical recordings this time, but something organic and patient. Around midnight, I begin the process I call harvesting, using accumulated terror from the previous nights to strengthen my connection with the entities. Robert's voice carried the professional satisfaction of someone explaining a successful business model. Your fear from the woman at the truck, the phone calls you didn't answer, the sounds from the bathroom. All of that energy has been collected and concentrated, waiting for tonight. The movement in the darkness grew closer, bringing with it a smell like copper and old meat. Not one thing approaching, but several, moving with the coordinated patience of pack hunters. The entities began manifesting more violently than before. Wasn't accurate, I realized. They had been here all along, just held in check by Robert's careful management. Tonight, he was finally letting them off their leash. Most subjects reached their breaking point within the first few minutes of harvesting, Robert explained, his tone remaining conversational even as shadows started moving independently of their light sources. The accumulated stress of multiple nights creates a psychological cascade that's quite spectacular to observe. The clock showed 11:59 p.m. But you've been building towards something different, haven't you? All that research, all those conversations with John and Jessica, you came back here knowing exactly what you were walking into, which means your terror is informed. Terror, conscious terror, much more valuable than simple ignorance. Midnight. The lights went out completely, but somehow I could still see. The darkness had texture now, movement, intention. Things that had been waiting in the deeper parts of the hidden room were finally given permission to approach. John's escape had been part of my plan all along, Robert said, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere in the dark. I needed someone to eventually discover the truth and return with maximum terror. And as the entities began moving toward me through the dark, I finally understood the full scope of Robert's manipulation. Every choice I'd made, every step I'd taken had been carefully orchestrated to bring me to this exact moment with the perfect combination of knowledge and despair. I was exactly where Robert wanted me to be. The entities moved closer through the dark, but something in John's voice echoed in my memory, the cycle of fear that powered the entities. Robert needed my terror to maintain control, needed me to break down and feed the system he'd spent years building. I forced myself to stand straighter instead of cowering. The shadows pressing against me felt less solid when I stopped giving them the reaction they wanted. Interesting. Robert's voice carried a note of genuine surprise. Most subjects are completely paralyzed by this point. Maybe you're losing your touch, I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. The entities hesitated, their forward movement stuttering like a video with connection issues. Through the darkness, I could hear Robert's breathing change, faster, less controlled. The fear is what binds them to my will, he muttered, more to himself than to me. Without sustained terror, the connection becomes unstable. That's when I heard voices outside the building, not the supernatural manifestations Robert had been orchestrating, but actual human voices calling my name. The storage room's hidden depth couldn't muffle the sound of car doors slamming and footsteps on gravel. "Mason!" John's voice carried clearly through the walls. "We're here!" Robert cursed, moving toward the front of the storage room with jerky, panicked movements. They weren't supposed to come tonight. The timing is completely wrong. The front door's lock clicked, followed by the sound of multiple people entering the main store area. Flashlight beams swept across the walls, visible even from our position in the hidden room. "Mason, where are you? A woman's voice, confident and determined. "That's Jessica," Robert said, his casual control finally cracking. "She's been more thorough in her research than I anticipated." The entities around us wavered, becoming less distinct as Robert's concentration split between maintaining his supernatural control and dealing with the unexpected interruption. Whatever process he'd started at midnight required his full attention, and the arrival of witnesses was breaking his focus. "Back here!" I called out, loud enough to carry through the building. Robert grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. Years of work, carefully accumulated energy." "I understand plenty." I pulled free from his grip, the movement easier than it should have been. The entities around us were becoming translucent, their forms wavering like heat mirages. "I understand you've been killing people for over a decade." Footsteps approached the storage room, accompanied by the steady sweep of flashlight beams. Robert moved to block the doorway, but his supernatural allies were no longer backing him up with their previous overwhelming presence. "Mason?" John appeared in the doorway, backlit by Jessica's flashlight. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." I stepped around Robert, who made no move to stop me. "But you need to see this." Jessica entered behind John, and her flashlight beam swept across the shelves lined with personal belongings. Her breath caught when she saw the labeled collections, the systematic organization of what amounted to trophies from missing persons. "My God," she whispered, "all these people." 15 years of subjects across 7 states, Robert said, his voice carrying a strange note of pride even as his supernatural operation fell apart around him. Each collection carefully preserved, their psychic imprints maintained and concentrated. Jessica moved deeper into the room, her flashlight revealing the full scope of Robert's collection. Dozens of names, hundreds of personal items, evidence of a systematic operation that had been claiming lives long before he'd arrived in Montana. "This is how you control them," John said, understanding dawning in his voice. "The entities are bound to these objects, powered by the terror of their previous owners. The personal belongings serve as psychic anchors," Robert confirmed, his professional pride overriding his caution. "Each item maintains a connection to its owner's final moments of terror, which I can access and amplify." Jessica had reached the deeper shelves, where older collections bore dates going back years. Her flashlight beam settled on one particular set of belongings, and her intake of breath was sharp enough to carry through the room. "John Northstar, March 2019, she read aloud. "Your wallet, your keys, your watch." John moved to stand beside her, looking at his own possessions from 5 years ago. "You kept them even after I escaped." "Insurance policy," Robert said. "I knew you'd eventually return, and I wanted to be prepared." That's when Jessica's research training kicked in. Instead of being overwhelmed by the scope of Robert's operation, she started thinking systematically about how to dismantle it. "If these objects are the source of his power," she said, pulling a heavy flashlight from her backpack, "then destroying them should break his control." Robert moved to stop her, but John blocked his path with the easy confidence of someone who'd been preparing for this confrontation for years. "You're not strong enough to stop all of us," John told him. "Not without your supernatural backup." Jessica brought the flashlight down on the nearest shelf, sending personal belongings scattering across the floor. Immediately, the temperature in the room spiked upward, and the wavering entities around us became even less distinct. "Stop!" Robert's voice cracked. "You don't understand the forces you're messing with." But Jessica was already moving to the next shelf, systematically destroying the careful organization Robert had maintained for years. I joined her, kicking over displays and scattering the collections that had once belonged to people who'd died in this same room. John grabbed a metal folding chair from the workshop area and started using it to sweep entire shelves clean, sending years of accumulated trophies crashing to the floor. Each destroyed collection seemed to weaken whatever supernatural forces Robert had been commanding. "They'll turn on me without the psychic anchors," Robert said, real panic creeping into his voice for the first time. The entities won't distinguish between us once their binding is broken. Around us, the shadows were moving differently, not with the coordinated patience Robert had been directing, but with confused aggression. The entities he'd been commanding were becoming independent, and their first instinct was to attack the person who'd been controlling them for years. Maybe you should have thought of that before you started collecting dead people's belongings, I said, stomping on a scattered pile of wallets and jewelry. Robert backed toward the rear of the storage room as his supernatural allies began focusing their attention on him instead of us. The confident manipulation he'd maintained for years was collapsing as the entities realized they were no longer bound to follow his commands. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered, his voice taking on the desperate edge I'd heard from his previous victims. "The process requires controlled conditions, careful timing." A sound like breaking glass filled the storage room, though nothing visible had shattered. The entities around Robert were becoming more solid, more aggressive, moving toward him with the hungry attention they'd previously directed at his victims. "We need to get out," John said, grabbing Jessica's arm as she finished destroying the last accessible shelf. "Whatever's been holding them back, it's not going to last much longer." The four of us moved toward the storage room exit, leaving Robert to face the supernatural forces he'd spent years commanding. Behind us, the temperature continued rising while the sound of breaking glass grew louder and more frequent. We made it to the main store area just as the lights went out completely, not just the storage room, but the entire building, plunging everything into absolute darkness. Through the walls, we could hear Robert screaming, not with the controlled terror he'd been harvesting from others, but with genuine panic as his own supernatural allies turned against him. "Outside," Jessica said, leading us toward the front door with her flashlight. "Now!" The gas station shook around us as we ran, the building's structure groaning under some kind of internal pressure. Whatever Robert had been containing in that hidden room was being released all at once, years of accumulated dark energy escaping without the careful controls he'd maintained. We reached the parking lot just as every window in the building exploded outward, showering the gravel with safety glass. The gas station's roof buckled, then collapsed entirely, crushing the interior space where Robert had been conducting his psychological experiments for years. The building continued collapsing for several minutes, folding in on itself with the methodical thoroughness of a controlled demolition. When the destruction finally stopped, nothing remained but a pile of twisted metal and concrete with no sign that anyone could have survived inside. John, Jessica, and I stood in the parking lot, watching the ruins settle. The October air felt normal again, cold and clean, without the metallic taste that had been present for days. "Is it over?" I asked. "It's over," Jessica said, though her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying this burden for years. 3 days later, I learned the official story from a brief article in the Miles City Star. Police had found human remains in the ruins of the gas station, apparently the victim of multiple animal attacks, though no animals were found in the area. The building had collapsed due to structural failure, possibly related to underground water damage. The land had been returned to the Northstar family, and the gas station would not be rebuilt. Morrison Corporate Holdings, the company that had purchased the property from Daniel Northstar, turned out to be a shell corporation with no traceable ownership. The police investigation found no evidence of criminal activity, just another tragic accident in a string of small-town misfortunes, but I knew better. Sitting in my apartment with my first steady paycheck in months, Jessica had helped me find work at the library. I finally understood the full scope of what had happened. Robert hadn't chosen me randomly from a pool of desperate job applicants. He'd been planning his final and most ambitious harvesting for years, waiting for exactly the right combination of circumstances and personality. Someone desperate enough to take the job despite obvious red flags, intelligent enough to eventually discover the truth, and stubborn enough to return with full knowledge of the danger, My own desperate circumstances, the unpaid bills, the failed jobs, the fear of becoming another quitter, had made me the perfect candidate for Robert's psychological experiments. But my refusal to break, my decision to fight back instead of simply enduring, had ultimately destroyed his entire operation. The entities he'd commanded for over a decade were gone, dispersed when their psychic anchors were destroyed. The 15 years of victims he'd claimed across 7 states would never get justice in any official sense, but their belongings were no longer being used to power supernatural predation. I was supposed to have been his masterpiece, the culmination of years of perfecting his psychological harvesting techniques. Instead, I'd become the catalyst for his destruction. And for the first time in months, I could sleep through the night without wondering what fresh horror was waiting for me in the dark.